The topic of today's case has been widely covered already, but there's something about this notorious serial killer that is so captivating that I think anybody's opinion or anybody's input on this case, I feel like it's a different spin every single time, so I'm going to put my own on it and let's get into today's case. Today I'm speaking about the notorious Ted Bundy, who took the lives of 20 confirmed women in the 1970s, but later admit to his count being way over 30, although some believe it was closer, if not above 100. So the definition would be that he was a serial killer, a sexual abuser, and a necrophiliac. He was finally arrested in February 1978 and received 3 death sentences for the murders of 2 Chi Omega sorority members of Florida State University and of a 12-year-old girl. I find one of the interesting facts about Ted Bundy's case is it was actually the first one to be televised nationally, and his kind of charming appearance actually helped him become somewhat of a celebrity during his trial. But he was then finally executed in January 1989 at the age of 42. So going back to Ted Bundy's childhood, Theodore Robert Cowell, formerly known as Ted Bundy, was born on the 24th of November 1946 to his mother, Eleanor Cowell. She gave birth to him at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. During Ted's early years, he lived this complete lie that led him to believe that his grandparents were actually his parents and his mother Eleanor was his sister. This was to avoid the stigma and shame from others within the community. It's said that Ted's grandfather Samuel Cowell was actually quite aggressive. He was quite the bully, and he had this violent streak to him. He would lash out verbally and physically towards others, his family members, and even towards the family dog. However, Ted actually held his grandfather in quite high regard. He had this profound respect for his grandfather and really looked up to him. There is speculation around who Ted's biological father is, but surprisingly no one has officially claimed him. One of Ted's co-workers later went on to write a book who suggested that Ted's father was a man named Lloyd Marshall, who was an Air Force veteran and a Penn State graduate. Others believed his father to be a man named Jack Worthington, and some believe that his grandfather was actually his biological father. Ted would eventually discover the truth about his sister actually being his mother, which was said to have a profound effect on Ted, and I can only imagine how devastating to anybody that would be to actually find out their whole life up to that point was one big lie. So Ted and his mother Eleanor would then move to Tacoma, Washington, where in 1951 Eleanor met the man that she would then go on to marry the following year, and his name was Johnny Bundy. Johnny was considered uneducated and lower middle class, and Ted actually disliked him for this reason. Eleanor and Johnny would go on to have a number of children together, and Ted would be formally adopted by Johnny, who became his stepfather, and he took on his surname of Bundy. During Ted's early years, he was considered by many as a bright child, but quite shy and withdrawn. But this can be normal for many children, but at just 3 years old, it's said that Ted had an unusual obsession with knives and sharp objects and would play with them and kind of gather them together, and he supposedly made a ring around his babysitter with knives. I would be straight out the door. So as a teenager, a darker side started to emerge in Ted. He would peep into people's windows, especially to watch women undress. He began stealing around this time with no real remorse for his actions, even when he was caught. He was arrested on 2 separate occasions. That was on suspicion of burglary and auto theft, but his record was expunged after his 18th birthday, giving him a complete clean slate. As Ted got older, he was actually considered quite popular at school, supposedly due to his good looks, but later claimed he preferred his own company and that the shyness from his childhood shined through into his adolescence. He believed he found it difficult to form relationships and friendships and didn't really have any romantic relationships until later on in university. So after Ted graduated in the 1960s, he went on to study psychology at the University of Washington. This is where he was believed to have stalked campus grounds, peeping in windows of fellow classmates, again to watch women undress. It was there he met Diane, a fellow classmate, and they became romantically involved. Diane was from a prominent family in California, and she was actually everything Ted supposedly aspired to be, which was confident, self-assured, and successful with money and class. But by 1968, Ted was working several minimum wage jobs before doing some volunteer work. Now, this is where things started to spiral for Ted, starting with the end of his relationship with Diane, who ended the relationship due to Ted's immaturity and lack of ambition. He was devastated and felt completely rejected. And this would actually be a focal point for him, as it's said that the majority of his victims actually resembled her. Ted did some travelling before returning to Washington in the fall of 1969. This is where he met Elizabeth, known as Liz, who he would manage to win over by the end of one of his nights out at the local tavern. They left together to go home that night, and that would turn into a 6-year-long relationship. Liz would actually later help the police with their case against Ted and go on to write a book about her experiences. It's in that year Ted began working for a medical supply company, driving a delivery truck. He began stealing from this workplace, and he was once caught stealing a photograph from a doctor's office. But his workplace found out about him stealing medical supplies, things like crutches and plaster used to make casts. He would use these to pretend that he was vulnerable in order to lure in women thinking that he needed help. It's said that in early 1972, Ted supposedly stalked a young woman from a bar and lay in wait ahead of her as she was walking home. But she actually stopped at her front door and went inside before she got to where he was waiting to attack. It's also said that a few nights later, he came across another woman. She was at her door and he attacked her from behind with a piece of wood, and she screamed, which caused Ted to flee the scene. Ted and his girlfriend Liz would then briefly break up, and he started working for a crisis call line when he was hired with the psychiatric outpatients at Harborview Hospital as a counsellor. During that time, they suspected him of doing a few inappropriate things and crossing some lines, but while working there, he met and began an affair with a fellow counsellor identified as Sandy, who would also later go on to speak with detectives about her experience and relationship with Ted. She told them they had slept together once, and although previously he was quite affectionate towards her and caring, quite gentlemanly, she actually described the encounter as really unpleasant. She goes on to say that they had gone for a picnic along Hump Tulips River where they drank wine, and she ended up feeling quite dizzy after only a little bit of wine. But while in the river, Ted continuously dunked her head under the water and was trying to pull off her bikini top. It's said that during their intercourse, he kept his arm pressed underneath her chin, choking her until he was finished. They then drove home, where Ted pretended like nothing had happened, and he just went about talking about his family and looking at the scenery as they drove. It's said she actually put a stop to the relationship and connection with Ted at this point. She also told detectives about how Ted would want her to go on these long drives through the hills behind Lake Sammamish, which is in the state park. It was actually in this area that some of his victims would later be found. Also in 1972, Liz and Ted resumed their relationship, but she began to see a completely different side to him. It's said that on one occasion he actually threatened to break her effing neck if she grasped on him for burglary. On another occasion, he came to her home to collect a crowbar that was supposedly his, and she seen something bulging from his pocket, and when she tried to grab a hold of it to see what it was supposedly surgical gloves. Around this time, their intimate relationship became quite erratic, and by 1973, Ted was back in contact with his ex, Diane, and he seemed to completely reevaluate. He cleaned up his appearance, and he really made an effort to win her back. That summer, he flew out to visit Diane, and his efforts actually worked as they began dating again, while he still maintained his unsteady relationship with Liz. Ted's first official victim was the following year. His MO seemed to be intrude or startle and rape before and after their murder. 12 of his victims' heads were decapitated, and it's believed he kept them in his apartment for his own gratification. It's believed he kept them in his apartment for a short period of time to relive the act for his own enjoyment. He would continue to visit the remains for his own pleasure, only stopping when they become too badly decomposed or wildlife had gotten to the remains. He supposedly later admitted to eating parts of his victims and stated, and I quote, "You feel their last breath leaving their body, you're looking into their eyes. A person in that situation is God." Between February and July 1974, Ted went on a spree of abducting, bludgeoning, raping and murdering several girls and women aged 19 to 23. 8 of his victims' remains were found in Taylor Mountains and Issaquah. 9 other victims were linked to Ted in Utah, Colorado and Idaho, and another 3 in Florida. But it is believed that there are a ton of victims, possible victims also. During this year, Ted was pulled over by the police, and he was arrested on possession of a variety of burglary tools. He had a bag with a crowbar, a mask, rope and handcuffs. 20 of Ted's victims were confirmed through evidence and admission, and Ted later confessed to 30 murders, but the FBI proposed that that number was actually around 36. In 1975, Ted was arrested for the kidnapping of a woman named Carol, one of the few who actually got away. He was convicted of this and received a 1 to 15 year sentence. I don't know how that makes sense. And he escaped prison twice in 1977. The first time he was indicted on murder charges, and he decided to act as his own lawyer in the case, which gave him access to the library. During a trip to the courthouse library, he jumped out of a window and made his first escape. He was captured 8 days later. In December, he escaped again by climbing out of an 8-inch hole that he'd made in the ceiling of his cell. He actually dropped more than 30 pounds to be able to fit through this hole, so he was determined to get out of there. No one even realised that Ted was missing for around 15 hours, giving him a major head start. After this second escape, he made it all the way to Tallahassee in Florida, and there at the State University, he attacked 4 young female residents of the Chi Omega sorority house and took the lives of 2 of them. He bludgeoned one to death with a chunk of firewood. He then strangled her with a stocking. Next, he beat and strangled another and sexually abused her. He mutilated her, leaving a deep bite mark in her flesh. He then bludgeoned to death 2 other students who were sleeping in the adjoining bedroom. His last known murder was that of a 12-year-old girl who he kidnapped from school, sexually abused and murdered. He then dumped her body under a pig shed. But it was these crimes that put an end to his rampage, as he was pulled over by the police later that month. The most damning evidence connecting Ted to the Chi Omega murders were the bite marks he left in one of the young girls, where there was a definitive match to Ted. The teeth impressions for the evidence were shown, in the court case at trial, which Ted was seen crouched down, getting real up close and personal, looking intently at all the photographic evidence. In early 1980, Ted met and married Carol Boone, who he had previously dated before his initial arrest. In the courtroom during the penalty phase of his trial is where they married. Boone then gave birth to a daughter in 1982, and she named Ted as the child's father. But after realising that he was guilty of his charges, she supposedly divorced him in 1986. After Ted's trial, he was convicted of murder and given 2 death sentences and another the following year, which ultimately led to his execution by electric chair in 1989. He spent 9 years on death row, appealing his sentence before his death, which were all denied. Criminologist Matt DeLisi argues in his 2023 book that Bundy likely murdered more than 100 people and believed this started in his younger years and adolescence, stating that the pacing and confidence of his murders between 74 and 78 indicated that there was no way that he just started. On the 24th of January 1989, Ted Bundy was executed around 7 a.m. at the Florida State Prison in the electric chair. Outside the prison, crowds gathered to celebrate Ted's execution. They was letting off fireworks, they was chanting, they was having a blast. They was having a great time. According to the Los Angeles Times, broadcaster James Dobson interviewed Ted before his execution, and he claimed that Ted was remorseful for what he had done, and he even wept during their conversations. Ted's body was transferred to the county medical examiner's office afterwards, and it's said that they actually removed his brain for a series of tests for research purposes. It was found to be seemingly normal, with no lesions, no injuries or deformities. His body was cremated in Gainesville with no public ceremony, and his ashes were actually scattered in the Cascade Mountains of the Washington state upon his own request. Why? Why grant that? I just don't get that. Considering this is where he took the lives of a number of his victims, I just don't get that. It just baffles my mind. So even after Ted's death, his whole life was televised. There are different series, films, and books have been released about Ted's life, people in his life, their experiences, and docuseries based on the interviews that were held with Ted. There are films ranging from 1986 right up to the current times. Ted's lawyer during his trial was Polly Nelson, who actually wrote a book herself about her experience with Ted, titled Defending the Devil: My Story as Ted Bundy's Last Lawyer. I think some interesting notes about Ted's case is that long before he was finally captured, several women approached the police about Ted. They said how they had been approached by a man named Ted. 3 women, including one of his ex-girlfriends, even pointed the finger directly at him. But police didn't believe their claims at this point because he had charmed his way through society at that and become somewhat of an upstanding member of society. But I think this rings true for most people like this, with that kind of narcissistic, abusive nature. They just present themselves in this way that completely hides their true self. Bundy fooled everyone around him and was accepted into law school, moving to Utah, but his thirst for violence only grew. He once picked up a hitchhiker who he sexually abused, strangled, and then dumped her body in a river before returning the next day to her body to take snapshots and dismember her. The 17-year-old daughter of a police chief was abducted by Bundy as she left a pizza parlor. Her body was found 9 days later, and her post-mortem indicated that she may have been alive for a week following her disappearance. Bundy seemed to view murder as a sport, and it's said he even admitted to an off-season where he would pick up women to keep his skills sharp and then set them free. He seemed to take just as much pleasure running rings around the police with what he believed was his superior intelligence, which again just rings totally true for that narcissistic nature. The mother of one of his victims actually said, for everything he did to the girls, the bludgeoning, the strangulation, humiliating their bodies, the torture, I feel like the electric chair is too good for him. And I totally agree. I think he should have been left to rot in prison. Also, not much is known about Carol Boone, who divorced Ted, or that of their daughter. It's presumed that they both changed their names to help them stay out of the public eye. On the night of Ted's execution, his last words were addressed to his lawyer, who at this time was Jim Coleman, and Fred Lawrence, a minister. His last words were, "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends," which just strikes me as a very typical thing someone would say at the end of their life. However, how many friends could you possibly have at that point, besides the shocking love mail that he received while he was in prison from many women? I mean, I get the fascination with true crime and all things educational, but a love interest in a prolific serial killer, I don't get that. There is so much more on and about Ted Bundy. However, if I went through it all, this would be tediously long. So that's it for today's case, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye!